I think we can all agree that Ben Shapiro is a very intelligent and also a quick thinker. However, in this video, it shows one of the very few instances that Ben Shapiro was actually bested in a discussion by none other than William Lane Craig, which again surrounded the topic of the Messiah. Now, I think this is an extremely powerful video, so definitely take a look. I'll be giving my reaction towards the end of the video, and subscribe for more videos like this. Let's get into it.
So what is the proof that Jesus was who he says he is in the Gospels?
Well, first we need to establish who he thought he was. When you look at the religio-historical context of the life and ministry of Jesus, I think you can show that among the historically authentic words of Jesus were claims that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, that he believed himself to be the Son of God in a unique sense that set him apart from Jewish kings and prophets, and finally, that he thought that he was the Son of Man predicted by the prophet Daniel, to whom God would give all dominion, power, and authority. So he had this radical self-understanding of being Messiah, Son of God, and the Son of Man. And at the trial scene before the Sanhedrin in Mark 15, all three of these titles come to a head when the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, that is the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am." And then virtually quoting from Daniel, "And you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the power." And at that point, the high priest rips his robes and says, "You have heard the blasphemy. What more witnesses do we need?" And Mark says they all condemned him as worthy of death. And that enabled them, since they didn't have the ability to carry out capital punishment, to deliver him over to the Roman authorities by slandering him as a pretender to be king of the Jews, and therefore a political figure who could be tried for treason and sedition and crucified.
So from the Jewish perspective, this narrative has some holes in sort of Jewish philosophy. The narrative begins with the idea that Jesus appears in front of the Sanhedrin and then claims to be the Messiah. Well, there's nothing actual criminally in any of the tractates that say that if you declare yourself the Messiah, this is actually a punishable offense, even. That, there are many Jews, including Bar Kokhba, who have declared themselves messianic figures.
Absolutely.
The real gap here is that in the Gospels, Jesus' vision of himself as the Messiah is completely different from the prior vision of what the Jewish Messiah is, and is actually outside the scope of how Jews describe the Messiah, or really have ever described the Messiah. The Messiah in Judaism has always been a political figure who is destined to do certain things, restoring the kingdom of Israel, maintaining control of that kingdom, bringing more Jews back to Israel. All of these things are considered sort of political things that the Messiah does. But the idea of the Messiah as embodiment of God is something that's foreign to Jewish religious philosophy going all the way back to the beginning. So even the idea that the Sanhedrin would be questioning him in those terms and would get from that what he means is, "I am God," which would be a much more punishable offense, presumably that would be actual blasphemy. It's an oddity.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that Jesus' understanding of the Messiah was radically different from the prevailing cultural understanding of the Messiah among the chief priests and the common people. And he didn't meet their expectations. Indeed, that's what helped to get him crucified. Being the Messiah, you're right, in and of itself isn't a blasphemous claim. But to claim to be the Son of God in a unique sense, and then especially the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel, sitting at the right hand of the power, that is truly blasphemous and is sufficient for his condemnation. Now, the question, I think, that is raised by your
interpretation,
question, Ben,
yes.
your interpretation, Ben, is this: why should we believe Jesus' reinterpretation of the Messiah rather than the one that the chief priests and the people held? And I think the answer to that is his resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection from the dead is Yahweh's public and unequivocal vindication of the man whom the chief priests had rejected as a blasphemer. It is the divine demonstration that these allegedly blasphemous claims are in fact true, that he was who he claimed to be, and that therefore I follow Jesus in his conception of what it means to be the Messiah.
So when it comes to the resurrection, why is resurrection proof of divinity? So Lazarus is resurrected.
That was why I wanted to emphasize the religio-historical context before we talked about the resurrection. A miracle taken in isolation is inherently ambiguous. The proper interpretation of a miracle is going to be given by the religio-historical context in which it occurs. And the resurrection of Jesus is not just the resurrection of any old body. It's the resurrection of the man who claimed to be Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man, and who was crucified for those allegedly blasphemous claims. If God has raised this man from the dead, then he has, I think, unequivocally and publicly vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims.
So one of the counterclaims to some of this is that the Gospels are written significantly after Jesus lives. Even the earliest Gospel is written, 70 CE? Somewhere 40 years after Jesus is crucified. So what's to say, that like most historical events, there is some play in the joints here. So that this would be the historical argument against the exact veracity of the gospel revelations, for example.
Now, I think it's important to understand, Ben, that in order for a historical document to be reliable, it isn't required that it be inerrant.
Contemporaneous, of course.
So,
of course.
What I would argue is that underlying the inference to the resurrection of Jesus are three great independently established facts, which are supported by the historical evidence, and which surprisingly, I did my doctoral work on this in Germany, are recognized as such by the majority of New Testament scholars today who studied the historical Jesus. And these facts would be that after his crucifixion and burial by a member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, that Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of his female followers. Secondly would be that various individuals and groups of people then witnessed appearances of Jesus alive. And finally, number three would be that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. The vast majority of scholars have come to accept as convincing the evidence in support of those three facts, not assuming biblical inerrancy or inspiration, but treating the Gospels as ordinary historical documents. You can show, for example, that the fact of the discovery of the empty tomb is attested by at least 6 independent sources in the New Testament, some of which are extraordinarily early. No scholar denies that individuals and groups saw postmortem appearances of Jesus. The only question is whether you should or could dismiss them as hallucinatory. And again, nobody denies that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So these three facts are pretty firmly established, and the only question is then how do you best explain them? And down through history, attempts have been made to explain these facts without recourse to the resurrection, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. And I would argue that none of these naturalistic theories meets the criteria for being the best historical explanation of the facts. None of them is as good an explanation as the one that the original disciples gave, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if that's right, then I think we have good grounds, indeed are almost compelled to revise our typical understanding of who the Messiah was supposed to be.
So we can have the historical argument back and forth, obviously, and I think that there are arguments that you can make. I think there are arguments that I can make, but I honestly find them relatively uninteresting, is the truth, simply because I'm not sure that we're going to come to any sort of consensus on them.
No.
On the historical argument, for example, I think it's fairly easy to claim there's a sect of Judaism right now in which there's a small subsection of people who believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still alive. Right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away in the 1990s,
Yes.
and there's still people who treat him as though he is not dead. They call him the Messiah. They think that he was the political Messiah. They have and they still do that 20 years after his death. That's not proof to me that he is actually alive. Some of them claim to have experienced it. Right. So especially when you're talking about events 2,000 years ago, if people write that down, I think there's sufficient.
I doubt this man's tomb is empty.
I mean, I haven't dug him up, so I wouldn't know. But the claims, if somebody claimed 2,000 years from now that his tomb was empty, or claimed 70 years from now that his tomb was empty, then
that's an important difference, Ben. The important time gap is not the gap between the events and the present. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence just because of the lapse of time. The critical event, as you just said, is the time gap between the events and the recording of those events. And in the case of the events of the life of Jesus and his resurrection, that time gap is extraordinarily narrow. We can push back even before the writing of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul by discerning the traditions upon which they relied when they wrote. And some of these go back to within, it's estimated, 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. I'm thinking of the ones that Paul transmits to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're on pretty good ground there in terms of the earliness and the multiplicity of our sources for the life of Jesus.
Now, I'll pause here. However, this has been an extremely interesting discussion so far. And what's very interesting so far, and again, I just want to really hats off to Ben because he was very, he listened in very well. He was able to allow William Lane Craig to be able to speak right through without interrupting him abruptly, right? So that's great. However, when your answer to very strong, convincing, historical, answers to some of your questionings about the Messiah is, I don't really care, it seems like uninteresting to me, then it really shows that, it's very easy at that point to really value your pride above one of the most important truths in life, which is the Messiah. It makes a whole lot of a difference. I think literally in that short time frame that we've been here together, William Craig literally was able to answer a lot of the arguments that Ben Shapiro had, and he moved on to a new question each time, and I just felt like it was overwhelming evidence that he needed to investigate a little more and to really think about a little more, because I think it was very powerful what he said, right? Now, I wrote down several different notes as well. I'll be mentioning a couple more things about what I think is very important. And however, one of the things to notice there, Ben Shapiro speaks a lot about facts don't care about your feelings. I think, in that case, he really has to really internalize and consider the facts and not allow his feelings to rise up, right? He even did a song recently, Facts Don't Care About Your Feelings as well. So again, Ben Shapiro, if you're listening to this, facts really don't care about your feelings. However, the true Messiah, Jesus himself, I believe, wants you to be able to, accept the facts about him. And what's very interesting about the Old Testament and the Torah, it actually pointed to the Messiah all throughout. Like if you look at Adam and Eve, the minute that they, essentially sinned, like God had to come in and sacrifice an animal that they may be able to just have that remission of sin, because without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. And that lamb pointed to Christ, really. From the very Genesis, it actually pointed to Christ. John 1:29 tells us, now behold a lamb which taketh away the sins of this world. Speaking about Jesus Christ, when John saw him coming afar off. So again, that's so essential, and all throughout the Old Testament, that it speaks about the Messiah to come. And Isaiah 53, very pointed prophecy that speaks about the Messiah. It's so clear that if you really read through it, you realize that there's no way at all you can literally doubt is Jesus Christ, providing that the historical account of Christ is accurate. And I think what William was sharing here is the accuracy of the historical account, and how there are so many witnesses that verified it, that, you know, his tomb wasn't, you know, his tomb was empty, that they verified that he actually was resurrected and risen. The disciples believed that as well. And it's so overwhelming evidence that Ben Shapiro was literally disinterested in, something that really shakes the entire Judaism movement today. And I think if anyone is listening to this, I mean, I believe it's very convincing about Christ being that Messiah that was to come and that came to this earth. And then final thing I'll leave with you as well is that, you know, I know Ben Shapiro mentioned that Jesus being the Messiah wasn't an offense. It would not have been an offense if he was the Messiah or something that was criminal. But Judaism in that time saw it as something that was criminal and offensive, right? Because again, in John chapter 10, verse 33, I mean, at that point, Jesus was being blamed for blasphemy. He is being told that he's blasphemous. Why? When you read John 10, verse 33, it says, because how can you make yourself God? They say that is blasphemy if you make yourself God, right? And then you go to Mark chapter 14, verse 64, it essentially says, ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? Right? And it says, and they all condemned him to be guilty of death. Like, he was condemned to be guilty of death. But guess what? The powerful thing about Christ dying, a lot of people think, well, how, you know, is he really God if he dies? Well, the powerful thing is Jesus is not dead right now. He came to die that he can save you and I from sin. However, Jesus is not dead. He is risen and he's alive. Unlike many of the other gods or prophets or individuals that is worshipped, just like William Craig brought out very beautifully about, you know, this man that Ben Shapiro brought up, and he asked him the simple question, well, is his tomb empty? And I think that is very important for many of us today to understand, is that many of those individuals worship in religious sectors, you know, a lot of them went into the grave, and that grave, there remains the bones of that person. But in the case of Christ, Jesus is risen, Jesus is King, and Jesus is Messiah, and he's coming again very soon for you and I. So if Ben Shapiro, if you're listening to this right now, or maybe if anyone else is listening to this right now who have not accepted Christ in their life, I pray that you give Christ an opportunity. You begin to continue to search the scriptures. Why? Because, you know, Christ told us that search the scriptures, for in them ye find eternal life. They are they which testify of me. And Jesus wants you to search the scriptures today. If you're willing to be able to search God's scriptures and to accept him as the Messiah, just go ahead and just in the comments as well, just let me know that Jesus is King, Jesus is the Messiah. And I'd love to be able to know if you agree with this as well. And, you know, if you have questions, feel free to leave it as well, so we can have an open discussion even in the comments. I'll do my best to respond to as many comments as possible as well. And again, feel free to hit that subscribe button. We have a lot more content coming for you in the coming weeks. Hit that subscribe button, and on the screen, probably somewhere right there, you will see a video that I'll recommend for you to watch next. And I look forward to seeing you again on the next video.